The security footage would be analyzed frame by frame for weeks afterward. At 8:47 hours on a Tuesday morning at Nellis Air Force Base, Captain Derek Voss raised his hand and struck Lieutenant Commander Kira Vallant across the face in front of 43 witnesses in the operations briefing room. The sound echoed like a gunshot. She didn't flinch, didn't touch her reddening cheek. She simply looked at him with those iron-gray eyes that had seen things most pilots only had nightmares about, and she said nothing. Voss was still smirking when the room went silent. Not the uncomfortable silence of shock, but something deeper, ancient, the kind of quiet that precedes avalanches. What none of them knew yet was that 3 phone calls had already been made. The first went to PACAF headquarters, the second to the Pentagon, the third to a retired vice admiral in Coronado who hadn't worn a uniform in 4 years but whose voice could still stop generals mid-sentence. Kira had known about none of these calls. She had simply turned and walked out of the briefing room, her flight suit crisp despite the Nevada heat, her boots measured against the tile. She had reported to the flight line as scheduled, run her pre-flight checks on the FA-18 Super Hornet waiting in the sun like a patient predator, and prepared for a routine training exercise over the range. Captain Voss had been talking for 3 weeks about how the Navy kept sending over washed-up has-beens to teach real fighter tactics. He'd made jokes about her age. 38 was ancient for a tactical pilot. He'd questioned her reflexes, her judgment, her right to be in the same airspace as men half her age with twice her ego. What he didn't know was that Kira Vellante had a call sign that wasn't in any official database. The pilots who'd served with her in classified operations didn't use it in reports or over standard frequencies. They saved it for moments when the impossible was required. They called her Reaper, not for death, for harvest, for gathering what others left behind. The base went about its morning. Maintenance crews fueled aircraft. Tower controllers managed traffic patterns. In the operations center, someone made a joke about the slap, and someone else shut it down fast. By 9:12 hours, 3 black SUVs were approaching the main gate at speeds that made the gate guards reach for their sidearms before recognizing the flags mounted on the hoods. Major General Sarah Kincaid, Lieutenant General Marcus Chen, and Vice Admiral James Torrent, who technically had no jurisdiction here but whose presence made jurisdictions irrelevant. The base commander received a call that lasted 8 seconds. Then he began shutting down Nellis Air Force Base piece by piece. By 9:20 hours, all training flights were grounded. By 9:25, the operations center was evacuated except for essential personnel. Captain Derek Voss was still in the briefing room, still riding the high of humiliating a Navy pilot nobody had defended. He was reviewing gun camera footage from previous exercises when 2 Air Force Security Forces members appeared at the door. They weren't there to arrest him. Not yet. They were there to escort him to a room where 3 of the most powerful military officers in the United States were waiting to explain exactly who Kira Vellante was and what he'd just done. But Kira was already airborne. Her Super Hornet had cleared the pattern at 9:15. Her flight plan filed for a standard air combat maneuvering exercise against 2 Air Force F-16s flown by hotshot lieutenants who'd been looking forward to schooling the old Navy lady. Her voice came across the tactical frequency calm and professional. Viper lead, Reaper is overhead the range at Angels 20, ready when you are. The F-16 pilots exchanged grins in their cockpits. This would be fun. They pushed their throttles forward and climbed to meet her. The engagement lasted 90 seconds. Afterward, the 2 lieutenants sat in their cockpits in silence, reviewing their displays, trying to understand what had just happened. Reaper had disappeared. Not on radar, she'd been right there, a solid return at 20,000 feet. But the moment they'd committed to their intercept, she'd done something their instruments couldn't explain and their training hadn't prepared them for. 1 second she was above them. The next, she was behind both of them, locked on simulated kills confirmed by the computer. Viper lead is dead, the lead pilot transmitted, his voice hollow. Viper 2 is dead. There was a pause, then Kira's voice, gentler now, almost apologetic. Good merge, gentlemen. Recommend you check your six before committing. Reaper is RTB. She turned her Hornet south and descended, leaving two confused F-16 pilots and a growing legend. In the conference room that had been commandeered by the generals, Captain Voss stood at attention. He wasn't scared yet, that would come later. General Kincaid sat across from him, her uniform immaculate, her expression carved from stone. Captain Voss, do you know who you struck this morning? Voss hesitated. Lieutenant Commander Volante, ma'am, Naval Exchange Instructor. Admiral Torrent leaned forward. His voice was quiet. That was worse than shouting. Lieutenant Commander Kira Volante. Naval Academy, class of 2009. Graduated top of her flight school class. Carrier qualified at 23. Flew combat missions over Syria, Iraq, and in classified theaters you don't have clearance to know about. She has 462 combat hours. She has personally trained 14 pilots who went on to become Top Gun instructors. She has 3 distinguished flying crosses, 2 Bronze Stars, and a Silver Star that's still classified. Her call sign, Captain, is Reaper. Voss felt his stomach drop. General Chen pulled out a tablet and turned it toward Voss. The screen showed gun camera footage from a mission 8 years prior. The timestamp was redacted. The location was redacted. What wasn't redacted was the FA-18 maneuvering through a canyon at 500 feet, enemy anti-aircraft fire stitching the sky around it, executing a bombing run that left a bridge collapsed into a river, while enemy troops watched helplessly from both sides. The pilot pulled up, rolled, inverted, and disappeared into the mountains. That was Lieutenant Volante at 30 years old, Chen said. She flew into a valley the Air Force said was suicide. She destroyed a target our drones couldn't reach and our cruise missiles couldn't hit because of the terrain. She did it at dusk, alone, with no AWACS support, and she made it home. Chen paused. 3 months later, she volunteered to do it again. The room felt smaller. Voss tried to speak, but General Kincaid raised a hand. You struck an officer, Captain. That alone is a court-martial offense. But what you did this morning goes deeper. You humiliated a pilot whose skill and courage exceed anything you will ever achieve. You did it in front of junior personnel who needed to believe their instructors were worthy of respect. You did it because she's a woman, because she's Navy on an Air Force base. Because you're weak, and weak men tear down what they can't become. She stood. This base is now locked down. Every officer in that briefing room is being interviewed. Every comment you've made about Lieutenant Commander Volante over the past 3 weeks has been documented. You're done. Voss felt the walls closing in. Ma'am, I didn't know, Admiral Torrent cut him off. You didn't know because you didn't ask. You didn't ask why a Navy pilot with her experience was assigned to train Air Force pilots in advanced tactical maneuvers. You didn't ask why her service record is partially classified. You didn't ask why she never talks about the missions that earned her medals. You assumed she was irrelevant because she's quiet, because she doesn't brag, because she's not like you. Torrent stood and walked to the window overlooking the flight line. Kira's Super Hornet was taxiing back toward the ramp, its engines winding down. She's been teaching you for 3 weeks, Captain. Not the curriculum. She's been watching how you lead, how you treat others, how you think under pressure. And this morning, you failed the only test that mattered. Outside, Kira climbed down from her aircraft. She removed her helmet, her dark hair pulled back in a simple bun, sweat marking her temples. A crew chief approached and handed her a bottle of water. She thanked him quietly and walked toward the operations building. She didn't know about the lockdown yet. Didn't know 3 generals were on base. She only knew she had a debrief to write and another training flight scheduled for the afternoon. The sky above Nevada was brilliant blue, the kind of blue that made pilots believe in God or fate or simple beauty. She had always loved that blue. It was constant, reliable, unlike people. The base remained frozen. Ground crews stood by their equipment, waiting for orders. Tower controllers watched empty runways. In the headquarters building, Lieutenant Colonel Amy Reeves, the base executive officer, was pulling personnel files. She'd been ordered to compile a complete record of every interaction Captain Voss had with Lieutenant Commander Volante. What she found made her sick. 3 weeks of casual cruelty. Comments about Kira's appearance. jokes about her age, suggestions that she'd slept her way into her position, and not one person had reported it, not officially. Reeves felt ashamed of her service, her base, her Air Force. She printed every document and prepared to hand it to the generals. Kira entered the operations building through a side door. She preferred to avoid crowds. The hallways were strangely empty. Usually there were pilots and maintainers moving between briefings, but today there was only silence. She found the debrief room and logged into the system to upload her mission data. The two F-16 pilots appeared in the doorway, still in their flight suits. They looked shaken. "Ma'am," the lead pilot said, his voice respectful in a way it hadn't been an hour ago. "We'd like to debrief with you if that's okay." Kira looked up, surprised. "Of course, have a seat." They sat. For a moment neither spoke. Then Viper 2 leaned forward. "Ma'am, what you did up there, we've never seen that." Kira smiled slightly. "You committed before you knew my energy state. I baited you into a climb, bled my speed in a way you couldn't see on radar, and used gravity to reverse. You flew past your own kill zone." The pilots nodded slowly, understanding dawning. This wasn't luck, this was mastery. "We'd like to learn that," Viper Lead said, "if you're willing to teach us." Kira considered them. "You're willing to listen now?" It wasn't a question. Viper 2 looked ashamed. "We should have been willing from the start, ma'am. That's on us." She nodded. "All right, tomorrow, same time, bring your notebooks." They stood, saluted, and left. Kira returned to her debrief, unaware that everything was changing. At 10:47 hours, the base commander, Colonel Richard Strauss, stood before his senior staff in a room that felt like a funeral. General Kincaid had just briefed him on the situation. He felt rage and shame in equal measure. "How did we let this happen?" he asked, though he already knew. They'd let it happen because it was easier to ignore than to confront. Because Voss was loud and confident and Kira was quiet and didn't complain. Because the culture of the fighter community sometimes protected bullies and punished targets. Strauss looked at his staff. "Effective immediately, Captain Voss is relieved of all duties pending court-martial. I want every pilot on this base to understand something. Lieutenant Commander Volante is not here as a favor. She's here because she's one of the best tactical pilots alive. If you don't believe that, check the footage from this morning." Dismissed. The word spread through the base like fire through dry grass. By noon, every pilot at Nellie's knew what had happened. They knew about the slap. They knew about the lockdown. And they knew that Reaper had just embarrassed two of their best F-16 pilots without breaking a sweat. In the squadron-ready rooms, conversations shifted. Pilots who'd ignored Kira or dismissed her suddenly wanted to know her story. They pulled up mission footage from public databases and found very little. Most of her career was classified. What they did find made them go quiet. A mention in a Navy report about a rescue mission. A commendation from a Marine ground unit she provided close air support for under impossible conditions. A notation in a strike fighter wing summary about an instructor who could make any pilot better. Kira was in the gym when someone from base command found her. She was running on a treadmill, headphones in, her pace steady and fast. The sergeant approached carefully. "Ma'am, Colonel Strauss requests your presence in his office immediately." She stopped the treadmill, grabbed a towel, and followed. She still didn't know. As she walked across the base, people stared. Some nodded with new respect. Others looked ashamed. She noticed but didn't understand. She arrived at headquarters and was escorted to the commander's office. When she entered, 3 generals stood. She froze. Her mind raced through possibilities, none of them good. Admiral Torrent spoke first. "Lieutenant Commander Volante, at ease. You're not in trouble. Sit down, please." She sat, her back straight, her hands in her lap. General Kincaid explained what had happened after the slap. The lockdown, the investigation, the interviews, the decision to court-martial Captain Voss and potentially others who'd created or tolerated the hostile environment. Kira listened in silence. When Kincaid finished, she waited for Kira to respond. Kira took a breath. "Respectfully, ma'am, I don't want this. I don't want a base shut down because of me. I don't want careers ended because someone hit me." Admiral Torrent leaned forward. "Kira, this isn't about what you want. This is about what's right. What Voss did was assault. What this base allowed to happen was institutional failure. You're a decorated combat veteran. You've earned respect. If we don't defend that, we don't deserve you. Kira looked down at her hands. They were steady, even though her heart wasn't. I just wanted to teach, sir. I wanted to help pilots get better so they come home, that's all. General Chen spoke, his voice gentle. And you have. The 2 pilots you flew against this morning just requested you as their personal instructor. 5 more have submitted requests since noon. You're changing this base, Kira. Not because of what happened this morning, but because of who you are. She felt something crack inside her chest. She'd spent so many years being quiet, being strong, being invisible. She'd convinced herself it didn't matter if people respected her as long as they learned from her. But it did matter. God, it did. She nodded slowly. Thank you, sir, all of you. Admiral Torrance smiled. Kira, I flew with your father. Did you know that? She looked up surprised. No, sir, he never mentioned it, Torrance chuckled. He wouldn't. Tom Vellante was the most humble man I ever met. Best naval aviator of his generation, and he acted like he was lucky to be there. You're just like him. That's a compliment and a curse. The world needs people like you, but the world often doesn't deserve you. He stood. We're going to make this right. You have my word. The generals left. Kira sat alone in the office, staring out the window at the flight line, trying to process everything. By the evening, the lockdown was lifted. Normal operations resumed, but nothing felt normal. Captain Voss was in custody, his career over. The pilots who'd witnessed the slap were required to complete intensive training on conduct and leadership. And Kira Vellante, who'd only wanted to teach and be left alone, had become the most talked-about pilot on the base. She walked to her quarters that night under a sky full of stars. The desert air was cool. Somewhere a jet engine started, the sound a familiar lullaby. She thought about her father, who died when she was 25 in a training accident. He taught her to fly before the Navy did, taught her that the sky was freedom and responsibility in equal measure. The next morning she arrived at the briefing room to find it full. 30 pilots sat waiting, notebooks open, eyes attentive. These were the same pilots who'd ignored her or snickered at Voss's comments. Now they were here to learn. She walked to the front of the room and set down her materials. Good morning. I'm Lieutenant Commander Vellante. Call sign Reaper. I'm here to teach you how to survive when everything goes wrong. I'm here to teach you how to bring your wingman home. And I'm here to teach you that the best pilots aren't the loudest or the flashiest. They're the ones who study, adapt, and never stop learning. Let's get started. For the next 3 hours, she taught them about energy management, threat assessment, and situational awareness. She taught them with patience and precision, and they listened like their lives depended on it, because they did. Weeks passed. The investigation concluded. Captain Voss was court-martialed and discharged dishonorably. 2 other officers received non-judicial punishment for failing to report the hostile environment. The incident became a case study at every military leadership school in the country. And Kira Vellante, who'd spent her career in the shadows, found herself in the light. She didn't enjoy it, but she accepted it, because the pilots she trained started coming back from deployments with stories. Stories of how her techniques saved their lives, how her lessons gave them the edge they needed. They sent her messages, photos, patches from their squadrons. One sent her a bottle of bourbon with a note. You taught me to see the fight before it happens. I'm alive because of you. Reaper forever. She kept the note, threw away the bourbon. She didn't drink anymore. Years later, a journalist asked her about that morning at Nellie's, about the slap heard around the military. She was older than a commander, still teaching, still flying. She thought carefully before answering. People think that day was about violence or justice. It wasn't. It was about visibility. For years, I'd been invisible, not because I wanted to be, but because being invisible kept me safe. The moment I became visible, everything changed. Not just for me. For every pilot who'd been dismissed or underestimated. That day proved that talent doesn't have a gender, courage doesn't have a rank, and respect isn't given. It's demanded, earned, and defended. The journalist asked if she was angry. Kira smiled. I'm a fighter pilot. I'm always a little angry, but I'm also hopeful, because I've seen what happens when good people decide to care. She never spoke to Derek Voss again. She heard he'd tried to reinvent himself as a civilian contractor, claiming he'd been the victim of a witch hunt. Nobody believed him. His name became a cautionary tale. Hers became a standard. At the Naval Academy, her lectures on tactical aviation were required. At Nellie's, a training room was named in her honor. She attended the dedication ceremony reluctantly, standing in front of a plaque that read, "Reaper Room, for those who harvest excellence." She touched the plaque once, then walked away. She had flights to plan and pilots to train. The work was never finished. The sky was always waiting. On a clear morning 10 years after the incident, she stood on the flight line at Miramar, watching a new generation of pilots pre-flight their aircraft. One of them, a young woman with nervous hands and determined eyes, approached. "Ma'am, I'm Ensign Ruiz. I just wanted to say, you're the reason I'm here." Kira studied her. "Tell me why," Ruiz straightened. "Because you proved it's possible to be excellent, to be respected, to be yourself." Kira nodded slowly. "Then make me proud, Ensign. Fly safe. Fly smart. And when someone underestimates you, show them who you are." Ruiz saluted and ran to her jet. Kira watched her taxi out, her Hornet gleaming in the California sun. The engine roar faded into the distance, and Kira Volante, call sign Reaper, smiled at the endless blue above, knowing she'd done what her father taught her. She'd made the sky a little safer for those who came after. That was legacy. That was enough.